I was born in Iran. I served in the US military. I've spent the last decade working in American politics, and almost everything we're being told about Iran today is either outdated or intentionally or unintentionally wrong. What's happening in Iran right now is not a protest cycle, it's not an unrest, it's not social media noise. It's the collapsed face of a regime that has been at war with its own people and the world for 47 years. Most commentary on Iran comes from the people who have never lived under it, never fled it, and never had to leave everything behind because of it. The honest truth is this: the Islamic Republic does not represent the Iranians, it occupies them, and it occupies their land. I lived under the same system as a religious minority until I was 11 years old. As the pressure increased, my family was left with no real choice but to flee. So we escaped to Turkey on foot. That story isn't unique. It's a story of tens of millions of Iranians living in diaspora today. Iran is a home of the Cyrus Cylinder, a 2,500-year-old declaration of human dignity. It traces back to Cyrus the Great, who freed the children of Jacob, Israel, from captivity, embraced religious liberty, and when he allowed them to return to their land, he provided them gold and silver so they could rebuild the temple. That history matters because it didn't end there. Today, the descendants of those same people, the children of Israel, are among the strongest allies of the Iranian people fighting for liberty, not because of politics, but because they understand what it means to live under a regime that seeks to erase your identity, faith, and truth. And that's the irony the Islamic Republic can't stand. A regime that claims to speak for Iran has positioned itself against the very people whose freedom was once championed by Iran's greatest king. A land once known for protecting the persecuted is now ruled by the system that persecutes in the name of God. This regime did not rise because it reflects the soul of the Iranian people. It rose because it learned how to weaponize fear from day one. For decades, the Islamic Republic survived by selling the same story to the world: that every uprising was temporary, every outrage manageable, every murder justified in the name of stability. That story worked in 1999. It barely worked in 2009. It failed in 2019. And today, it doesn't work at all. What you're watching now is not just anger, it's exhaustion. It's a generation that no longer fears live ammunition more than it fears continuing to live this way. And here's the part most analysts miss: this moment didn't appear overnight. It was shaped by decisions made far beyond Iran's border, decisions made in Washington, decisions made by the Allies, decisions that either emboldened this regime or put it on notice. In this episode, I'm not going to sell you hope or fear. I'm here to give you clarity. We're going to walk through how we got here, how this regime has suppressed dissent for 47 years, how the world responded, how the US policies changed the regime's behavior, and why the events of October 7th didn't start something new but exposed something that was already rooting underneath. By the end of this episode, you understand why this isn't just another chapter in Iran's story, but the moment where the story starts to break open. If you want to understand why this moment is different, we have to go back to 2009. That year, Iran was closer to a real change than most people in the West are willing to admit. Millions of Iranians poured into the streets believing something very simple: that their vote still mattered. The Green Movement wasn't radical, it wasn't violent, it wasn't calling for the collapse of the system. People weren't chanting death to the regime like they are today. They were chanting, "Where is my vote?" And that distinction matters. In 2009, majority of Iranians still believed the Islamic Republic could be corrected from within. They believed the system was flawed, not fraudulent. They believed reform was possible, and for a brief moment, history was open. What happened next shaped everything. As protesters were beaten, arrested, and killed in the streets, Iranians looked outward. They weren't asking for foreign intervention, they were asking for moral clarity. And they asked one question over and over again: Obama, are you with them or are you with us? That chant wasn't symbolic, it was literal. At that moment, the Obama administration faced a choice: to stand clearly with the Iranian people or pursue engagement with a regime that was crushing them. He chose engagement. The calculation was strategic, the intention was diplomacy, but the message received inside Iran was unmistakable. The West would negotiate with their oppressors, even as they spilled blood in the streets. The regime learned something critical in 2009. It learned that it could use overwhelming force, silence dissent, and still be treated as a legitimate partner on the world's stage. At the time, Iran was publicly led by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, but everyone inside the country knew who truly held the power: the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and the security apparatus beneath him. The lesson the regime took wasn't just that repression worked, it was that repression worked without consequences. When President Obama entered office, his administration believed engagement could moderate the regime, reduce pressure, offer incentives, bring Iran into the global system. But the regime like this don't respond to goodwill the way democracies do. They respond to leverage. What followed didn't empower the Iranian people, it empowered the Islamic Republic. Sanctions relief gave the regime breathing room. Diplomatic legitimacy gave it cover, and repression didn't soften, it became more efficient. Inside Iran, dissent didn't disappear, it went underground. Fear didn't vanish, it hardened. By the time protests erupted again in 2017 and 2019, the language had changed. No more reform, no more votes, no more patience. People weren't asking the system to fix itself anymore. They were calling it illegitimate. And the regime responded faster, harder, with far more confidence. Why, you might ask? Because it believed it had already proven something in 2009: that it could survive mass protest, international outrage, and still secure deals with the world's most powerful governments. That belief would eventually become its greatest mistake. Because while the regime thought it had stabilized itself, something irreversible had already happened. An entire generation started believing in the lies. They saw that reform was dead end, that elections were theater, that silence was survival, and that exile was often the only way to stay alive. That's why the diaspora grew. That's why protests never stopped, they evolved. And that's why the confidence the regime built during this period would later turn into an overreach. By the end of the Obama era, the Islamic Republic believed time was on its side. It believed pressure had limits. It believed the world needed it more than it needed the world. That assumption collided with reality. Because for the first time since 1979, fear would begin moving in the opposite direction: upward, not downward. Everything the Islamic Republic believed coming out of 2009 rested on one assumption: that pressure had limits and that the West would always blink first. That assumption was tested in 2017. When President Trump entered the White House, Iran was no longer treated as a misunderstood actor in need of engagement. It was treated as what it was: a revolutionary regime that used diplomacy as cover and terror as policy. The doctrine of the Trump administration was simple: peace through strength. No more endless war, but no appeasement. Pressure, clarity, and consequences was a way to go. Sanctions were immediately reimposed and aggressively enforced. Revenues dried up, access to global markets tightened. The regime's ability to fund proxies, buy loyalty, and export chaos began to collapse. For the first time since the revolution, the Islamic Republic felt real pain it could not spin away from. Inside Iran, people also noticed. Salaries went unpaid, subsidies disappeared, corruption became impossible to hide, and the myth that resistance had no cost began to crack. Then in January 2020, the illusion of invincibility shattered. The United States eliminates Qasem Soleimani, the architect of Iran's regional proxy network, the man responsible for exporting terror and violence across Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, the symbol of regime's belief that the operatives were untouchable. This wasn't just a military strike, it was psychological. For decades, figures like Soleimani operated under the assumption that geography, status, and deniability made them immune. That assumption died with him. Inside the regime, the reaction wasn't unity, it was pure panic. Because the message was unmistakable, escalation would not guarantee safety, and titles would not provide protection no longer. The regime responded with theater. Missiles fired, speeches made, flags burned, but everyone inside Iran knew the truth. For the first time since 1979, fear had stopped flowing only in one direction. It began moving upward. The Islamic Republic survived, but it emerged exposed, weaker, more cautious, and far less confident than it pretended to be. When the pressure eased in 2021, the Islamic Republic wasn't reformed, it was revived. Under Joe Biden, sanction enforcement softened, diplomacy returned to the center of the policy, and the regime was given something it desperately needed: oxygen. With that oxygen came a lot of money. And with money came confidence. Instead of stabilizing internally, the regime did what it has always done when it feels emboldened. It expanded outward, funding proxies, arming militias, training terror groups, betting that once again the world preferred negotiation over confrontation. Groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and others didn't act in isolation. They acted as a part of this strategy built on distance and deniability. Fight through others, bleed enemies indirectly, keep the regime hands clean. That a strategy collapsed on October 7th. What that day has exposed wasn't a strength, it was dependence, a web of proxies designed to keep the Islamic Republic insulated from direct consequences, a system that only works as long as nobody pulls the thread too hard. Israel did exactly that. What followed wasn't retaliation for optics, it was dismantling. One by one, the regime's proxies were degraded, leaderships eliminated, supply lines disrupted, myths shattered, and something critical happened in parallel. The Islamic Republic didn't step in directly, not because it didn't want to, but because it couldn't. For all the slogans, all the threats, all the promises of regional war, the regime hesitated because direct confrontation would expose what proxy warfare had been hiding for decades: pure weakness. As the proxy networks began collapsing, Iran's so called allies grew quieter. Russia had its own war to manage, China had its own economy to protect. Neither was willing to risk escalation for a regime that brings more instability than value. And at home, the Iranian people were watching billions spent abroad while their currency collapsed, watching terror exploded in the name and their name while they were beaten in the streets, watching the regime claim strength while avoiding direct confrontation. That's when the narrative finally broke. A government that can protect its people, a regime that won't fight its own wars, an ideology that demands sacrifice from everyone except those in power. This is where overextension becomes exposure. A system built on fear, distance, and denial suddenly forced into the open, with nowhere left to hide. What we have been talking about this far explains the pressure. What's happening now is the release. Over the last several weeks, Iran has not been experiencing unrest. has been experiencing a full-scale revolutionary uprising. The regime knows this. That's why it has responded the same way it always does when it's genuinely scared. It shut down the internet, not to restore order, to isolate the Iranian people, to simply kill them in the dark. Entire regions have been cut off from the world, mobile networks shut down, communications severed, not because the protests are small, but because they are everywhere. And while the cameras are turned off, the violence escalates. This is not about dozens of deaths. It's about tens of thousands murdered in cold blood over time, imprisoned, disappeared, and executed, many of whom are young, many of whom are women, many of them teenagers. This is not law enforcement. This is the regime's survival tactic. At the same time, something else happened that the regime never expected. During the 12-day war, the Islamic Republic lost control in ways it had spent decades insisting were impossible. Senior leaderships were eliminated overnight. Command structures were exposed. Airspace was penetrated. And for the first time, the regime could not protect its own territory. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't theatrical. The myth of control collapsed in front of the world's eye. For years, the Islamic Republic projected its strength through proxies, threats, and slogans. But when tested directly, it couldn't defend its own skies, secure its leadership, or impose its will. That's not power, that's vulnerability. And this is where leadership matters. For the first time in years, there was no ambiguity coming from Washington. President Trump made it very clear where he stood with the Iranian people and not their oppressors. He has stated plainly that if the regime continues shooting its own citizens, the United States will not look the other way as done before. Those words weren't performative, they were simply deterrent. And alongside him, Benjamin Netanyahu did what Israel has always done when existential threats become real. He acted not recklessly, not emotionally, but decisively. Leadership nodes were removed, capabilities were degraded, and the regime's assumption that it could operate with impunity was shattered. Here's the irony that should never be ignored. The same regime that demanded nuclear weapons is this in the name of security. Yet, even with the weapons it already has, guns, prisons, execution chamber, it doesn't use them to defend its people. It uses them to murder its own citizens. A government that cannot be trusted with basic power over its population cannot be trusted with the most destructive weapons on earth. And the regime knows this. That's why it isn't escalating directly. That's why it's pleading for restraint abroad while cracking down harder at home. That's why it's cutting cables instead of defending borders. This is what late stage regimes look like when they're cornered, exposed externally, illegitimate internally, and terrified of their own people. This is no longer a question of if pressure matters. It's a question of whether the world sustain it long enough for history to finish the job. There's a question that always comes next, and it's a fair one. If this regime falls, then what? This is where people usually reach for the same tired comparison: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. And that's where they get Iran completely wrong. Those countries all collapsed into chaos because when the regimes fell, there was nothing legitimate waiting on the other side. No unifying figure, no historical continuity, no trusted alternative. Now, Iran is different. And the difference starts with this image right here. You've probably seen it. A photo of Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi praying on the walls of Jerusalem. People see that and immediately reach for the propaganda line. He's the puppet. He's backed by Israel and the West. He doesn't represent the Iranian people. That reaction only makes sense if somebody doesn't understand the history of Iran or the region. Those walls exist today because of another Iranian king, Cyrus the Great. More than 2,500 years ago, Cyrus freed the Jewish people from captivity, recognized their faith, and enabled them to return and rebuild their temple. That relationship wasn't political, it was civilizational. That's why to this day, there are streets named after Cyrus, Korosh, in every major city across Israel, not out of nostalgia, but out of gratitude. So when people see the crown prince honored there, they're not seeing foreign influence. They're seeing historical continuity. They're seeing a reminder of what Iran was before it was hijacked. Here's the critical distinction. Reza Pahlavi isn't presenting himself as a ruler imposed from abroad. He's positioning himself as a unifying figure, committed publicly and consistently to a democratic transition, national reconciliation, and a secular state that protects all faiths. Now that matters because revolutions don't fail when dictators fall. They fail when societies can agree on what comes next. Iran has something rare, a living bridge between its past and its future, a figure who represents national identity without demanding absolute power, continuity without coercion. That's the difference between Iran and the disasters everyone fears. Iraq had no unifying civilian alternative. Afghanistan had no national identity stronger than factionalism. Libya had no institutional memory of peace. Iran does. Decades of forced amnesia don't erase the civilization, they suppressed it. And when you listen to Iranians inside the country and across diaspora, you don't hear the calls for theocracy or revenge, you hear calls for dignity, normalcy, and peace. Not isolation, not endless war, not ideology imposed at gunpoint. A future Iran led by the people who understand in history doesn't threaten the region, it stabilizes it. Because a free Iran doesn't need proxies, it doesn't need terror, it doesn't need enemies to survive. It becomes what it always was meant to be, a nation at peace with itself and its neighbors. And that's exactly why the current regime fears this conversation more than any protest. If all of this feels familiar, it's because we've seen this movie before. It's the final years of the Soviet Union. The regime didn't collapse because it lost a single war. It collapsed because it ran out of legitimacy. On paper, the USSR looked powerful to the last minute. It still had weapons, it still had allies, it still had the slogans, but underneath, it was hollow. Their economy was exhausted. Their ideology no longer inspired belief. The people no longer consented, and the system was everywhere abroad while collapsing at home. So it leaned harder on proxies, on fear, on repression, on the idea that its strength could substitute for trust. It couldn't, and neither can it today for the Islamic Republic. What we're watching now isn't the rise of something new, it's the exposure of something old. A regime that fights through proxies because it can't fight directly. A regime that exports ideology because it can't inspire loyalty. A regime that survives on fear because it has lost consent. That doesn't make it strong, it makes it brittle. And brittle systems don't bend, they simply break. This is the phase where history speeds up, where small decisions carry enormous weights, where simple miscalculations compound instead of reset. The danger right now isn't that the Islamic Republic is powerful. The danger is that it knows it's running out of time. That's when regimes lash out. That's when mistakes happen. That's when pressure matters the most. And that brings us back to the Iranian people. They are not asking the world to save them. They are not asking the world to stop. They're asking the world to stop enabling their oppressors. They are not asking for war. They are asking for truth, pressure, and consistency. History doesn't move because people suddenly become brave. It moves when fear changes direction. And in Iran today, fear is no longer flowing only downward, it's moving upward toward a regime that has lost legitimacy at home, credibility abroad, and patience from its own people. Revolutions don't begin when crowds gather, they begin when systems run out of exits. And that's exactly where we are today.